welcome. So you can follow along in your textbook. You can follow along with the slides themselves. I hope the figure number actually helps so that you can kind of find them later if you need to. But they're all in the reading assignment. This was your reading assignment for today, right? Is that correct in my head? 5.1 through 5.3?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a big one. And there's a lot to talk about. So we're going to try to get through this in about 30 minutes or so. I want to talk to you after this about the functional group sheet that I handed out and that's on the coursework page. And we'll just talk about, which molecules had which functional groups. And then we've got some more AP Classroom problems to work on, and that's it for today. We're going to actually build some of these molecules in the next class or two. I have little molecular kits that we can use to give you a more three-dimensional perspective of these things. But there's 4 big molecules, literally kind of big for a molecule, that we need to know about in this class. And what are they?
Carbohydrates.
Carbohydrates. Come on, Monday morning. First class Monday morning.
Proteins?
Proteins, nucleic acids, and then these lipids. So here they all are. Now, some of these diagrams are going to look a little weird, or some of them might look a little familiar. But as we go through all of them, they will become a bit more clear. We're going to just talk about carbohydrates and lipids today. What's an example of a carbohydrate? What's an everyday word for a carbohydrate? Yeah. A lot of times people refer to them as carbs. You're right. When people say carbs, they're referring to carbohydrates, and kind of what kinds of foods are they referring to when they say carbs?
Bread.
Yeah. What does bread have in it? Yeah. It is made from grass seed, starches, and sugars. So when you hear like sugar, that's a carbohydrate. That's right. And then when I say lipids, which are the other molecule we're going to talk about today, what does that make you think of, or what does that refer to? Say so.
Fat.
Yes, fats. Good. We're going to talk about sugars and fats today. They are delicious. And they are delicious because they are so important and your brain rewards you for eating them. All right. So again, these diagrams that you're looking at will make more sense by the end of the week. Now, before I move on, except for fats, these are typically going to be what we call polymers. And you should be familiar with the term polymer. What does poly mean?
Multiple.
Multiple or many. That's all it means. Polymers are just chemicals that are made up of many of, not necessarily the exact same, but many of the same types of units. And those single units are called monomers, mono meaning one. So a bunch of monomers bonded together in a long chain is going to be a polymer. And that is exactly what we see in carbohydrates. You can have kind of the monomers by themselves, like glucose, which is a sugar. It is a lot like table sugar, but table sugar is a little different. We'll talk about it. And then when you say things like starch, those are carbohydrates that are a bunch of these glucose molecules bonded together in certain ways that can form kind of certain patterns or shapes of chains. We will talk a lot about glucose. And while glucose is not table sugar, meaning, the stuff that you cover cornflakes in to make them taste good, it is blood sugar. So when you hear the term blood sugar, you're actually referring to the glucose that is in your blood, that your blood is carrying. All right. Now, before we talk any more about carbohydrates or any of these other molecules, we need to look at how it is that these individual parts can bond together. And the other important thing is kind of the opposite reaction, which is how when you eat bread, or if you eat a whole potato, preferably baked, can you take the starch and chop it up into glucose so that it can travel through your bloodstream and get where it needs to go? And that's what this slide references. There are two really, really important reactions for this unit that we're going to talk about. One is called a dehydration reaction, and the other is hydrolysis. Those are two terms you definitely want to put in your notes, have in your brain. And these are kind of diagrams that you'll want to be familiar with and understand how to replicate for the purposes of making your own little diagrams. What do we call this OH functional group? Hydroxide would be the name if it was OH by itself, unbonded with a negative charge, but it's close. Hydroxyl, good. So what happens in many or most or maybe even all of these, especially in these specifically dehydration reactions, is that you usually have a hydroxyl group and then just a hydrogen on another molecule. Now, when you see an H and then an H and then an O, what do you start thinking of? Water! And there it is right there. Basically, when you have a situation like this, two molecules, and there's a hydroxyl group and a hydrogen group, there are enzymes, and we'll talk about enzymes later, there are enzymes that can kind of rip those off. They react together to form water molecules. And then the bonds that are available when these are removed are reformed in a way where these two molecules are now covalently linked. So our chain, our polymer of 1, 2, 3 monomers, can add a fourth one on by simply removing the water, which is why we call it a dehydration reaction, because you just remove water. It's a loss of water, or a loss of a water's worth of atoms. You are doing this all the time. Plants are masters of this chemical reaction. It's a great way to take tiny things you need, package them together, and store them away. Or use them if you need them in this larger form. Now, if removing a water molecule helps you add a monomer, what do you think you can do to break that monomer off? Add water back. And that's this idea of hydrolysis. We can actually add these groups back on. Again, this is usually driven with the help of enzymes. And you can separate your monomers. It's a very useful way of basically building and breaking down things in the chemistry of life within the cell. We will practice this a little bit this week. We have a little lab activity, like I said, where we're going to use these kits to build molecules, like physical representations of molecules. And there's some diagramming you'll have to do, and we'll practice kind of drawing this, but I want you to just keep it in the back of your head. You can add to the chain or you can break the chain, and it's simply a matter of, adding and removing these water molecules. By the way, lyse or lysis kind of refers to the process of splitting. Literally, it translates into like the process of water splitting, but you're not splitting the water, you're splitting using water in this process. Now, this is how we build a lot of your more complex carbohydrates. It's how you put amino acids together to make proteins. It's how you build the RNA and DNA that encodes all the information in your cells. And these processes are also how you can kind of create certain lipids, certain fats and oils in your body. Even though they're not polymers, you can still connect things together using these two processes. Questions? Okay. So we're going to focus on carbohydrates first. One thing I want you to try to kind of keep in the back of your head, because sometimes they use this little fact as a way to ask kind of the trickier questions on some of these AP exam style questions that we use the AP classroom to practice. Here are some molecular representations of simple carbohydrates. Now, they may not look simple to you. If chemistry is something you're taking right now, or wasn't your strong suit, I don't want you to be scared by this. Remember, we do not fear in this class. Have no fear. Some of this stuff is more complex looking than you don't need to know all the complexity behind what you're looking at. But I do want you to note something. There are only 3 elements that are ever involved with carbohydrate production. And what are they? And you can kind of guess it from the name carbohydrate.
Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon.
Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's right. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Show. Those are the only 3 elements you see here. You will find some questions on your AP classroom, which is, again, supposed to get you ready for the AP exam. So that's why we're going to use them as practice from time to time. But sometimes they talk about like nitrogen and phosphorus, and how a living thing might not have access to nitrogen or phosphorus for some reason. Well, that doesn't affect carbohydrate production or carbohydrate availability. You don't need those elements for the production of carbohydrates necessarily. Okay, so here you see these 2 terms, linear and ring form. A lot of your simple sugars, some of these simpler carbohydrates that you're looking at here, like this is probably glucose, it looks like glucose. Sometimes the carbon atoms and all their side atoms can form this kind of straight chain of carbon. So this is a linear form. All right? These sugars can actually move between that form and a ring of atoms like you see here. It's the same chemical, it just has kind of a different geometry to it. The only reason I'm pointing this out is because sometimes I'll refer to one or the other, but for most of our purposes, it will never really matter. I just want you to understand that they can appear as both forms. And in fact, a lot of times in your book, they will reference glucose and they will simply, again, and I mentioned this, draw a kind of geometric shape, in this case, like a hexagon, to represent this more complex looking, every carbon drawn with the number of the carbon on it. We don't need this kind of complexity in our lives. Not for AP biology. So a lot of times you'll have more of an abbreviation when it's in its ring form, and they just draw the general shape of the atomic ring at the core of the molecule, and then they'll show all the side groups. Sometimes your book will just show little hexagons. They'll be like, hey, check out this diagram with glucose, and they'll just have these shapes. They won't have any letters written on it. And I don't care about the numbering system either. So again, sometimes some of this complexity is, I don't want to say unnecessary, but it's more complexity than we need to discuss it. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and I know compared to a lot of the chemicals that you talk about in a chemistry class, this looks complex. But this is actually a pretty simple molecule. It's just one sugar, one little monomer right here. So, let's talk about slightly more complex sugars. Again, this looks scary, but all we're looking at here is what? What in general is happening here and here? It's basically the same process, just with some different building blocks. They're all carbohydrates. And what's happening, say, in the reactant to product side? It's a dehydration reaction. We're pulling out water, and that is freeing up bonds for these two individual sugars to bond together to make a more complex sugar. You've probably heard the term like complex carbs. You'll see that a lot of times in relation to kind of dietary discussions. So this is a glucose molecule. This is a really standard sugar. It looks a lot like, say, another simple sugar called fructose, but if you notice, there's a few differences in the ring shape and some of these little side groups that come off of it. I will never ask you, I will never give you a picture and say, what is it? I'll just say like, hey, look, it's glucose, and this is the structure of glucose. And you just want to go, oh, it's a simple sugar. It's a single monomer, a single sugar by itself. But you can connect them through dehydration. Two glucose molecules together creates a more complex sugar that is called maltose. By the way, there's other sugars on here, fructose and sucrose. What are you noticing about the naming pattern for sugars?
Ose.
Ose! Good! When you see ose at the end, sugar. Carbohydrate. Just think that. That's where your brain should go. Those are the little things that you should be literate in AP biology. Now here in the bottom, the exact same thing is happening. We're just pulling out a water molecule. That's a dehydration reaction. It's causing two simple sugars to bond together into this more complex, this is one molecule. And the only difference between the top and bottom is that here we have two glucose molecules, and here we have a different sugar, fructose, that we're connecting to glucose. When you have these two sugars specifically, it makes a molecule called sucrose. And this is table sugar. Sucrose is table sugar. It is the sugar that you cook with, that we sweeten things with very often. There are other sweeteners, but sucrose is a very common one. When you have a single sugar by itself, like glucose, we refer to these with a term monosaccharide. I'm going to write on the board right here. Monosaccharide. Saccharide refers to sugar, and mono just means one. Let me see if I can lower this just right. Stay. Good. What do you think? And notice, monosaccharide, one ring basically. Why are you doing this to me? What is happening? Could you pause the recording real quick? Or just stop it and we'll